Alrighty, I'm going to be doing a short presentation on the history of the British Empire. It's going to be very short, but I think it'll be kind of fun to explore somewhat of an interesting uh, topic, very important for world history in the past few hundred years, and it's influenced the world to a large extent. And it still influences politics today and culture today and all sorts of matters and things like that of today. So it is an incredibly interesting topic, and this is just going to be a broad overview. Now, here is a map, generally speaking, of all the areas that the British Empire has ever controlled, the areas being in red. So it wasn't ones simultaneously, but these are all areas that they controlled at least at some point in history or even today. So, of course, we have starting off with Britain over here, Ireland. You have places like Gibraltar, the 13 colonies, later became the United States, Canada, British Guiana, Egypt to South Africa, Australia, India, the Antarctic territories, places around the Caribbean, um, and it's very interesting to see all these. So this is just a broad overview. It's a map, something good to reference, and each one of these places has a very intense history. You could do an entire presentation on it, but this is just a broad overview. So why is the British Empire important? I just copied this actually from Wikipedia, and I think it's worth reading. They compromised the dominions and colonies, protectorates, mandates, and other territories ruled under the administration of the United Kingdom. I might add, from London. It originated with the overseas possessions and trading posts established in England between the late 16th century and early 18th century, which means the 1500s to the 1700s. At its height, it was the largest empire in history. Unbelievable, right? For over a century, it was the foremost global power, that century being the 1900s, primarily. By 1922, the British Empire held sway over about 458 million people. Now, that's more than live in the United States currently, being January 2016 when I'm making this video. One-fifth of the world's population at the time. So that means they held one-fifth of the world's population at the time. The empire covered more than uh, 13 million square miles, almost a quarter of the Earth's total area. As a result, its political, legal, linguistic, and cultural legacy is widespread. And we'll discuss that. I mean, talking about Australia and places like that. At the peak of its power, the phase of the empire on which the sun never sets was often used to describe the British Empire. Because of its expanse around the globe meant the sun was always shining, at least on some part of its territory. So that means the empire in which the sun never sets. The sun never sets on the British Empire at the time that it was, because there was always a piece in the territory, in the world, where the sun was shining. And that makes sense. You look at Canada, India, Burma, Australia, the African territories, and England. So anywhere here, the sun was shining, at least at one point. So this identifying flag is the Union Jack. You notice it's the flag of Britain. Just here's the geographic scale. Here's the identifier. That's good to know. And again, all these images are from Wikipedia, and none of them are mine. I don't claim any ownership, but they're in the public domain, and you can use them for educational purposes and things of that nature, and other uses as well. So this is just going to be a rundown of the table of contents, a screenshot of that from Wikipedia. You got your origins. We're going to talk about that, the first British Empire, and then the rise of the second British Empire, and then the British Imperial Century, and then we'll go to the World Wars and decolonization after the World Wars. So the origins, how things started, the First Empire, the Second Empire, the Imperial Century, Pax Britannia, as some may call, World Wars, and decolonization and decline. The origins, we start off here from the 1400s, the 1500s. England just started off as a place, so to speak. It was just part of England. You have to go back and look at the kingdoms, how England formed from the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy with the Kingdom of Mercia in the Middle Ages and influence around Europe, and then sort of formed later on there. Then you can continue on, and you look at just several pictures right here. This is Queen Elizabeth the First. Of course, she was queen during the time of Shakespeare, and then you have a map of England right here. And continuing on, you have actually the ship of it's a replica of the Matthew John Cabot ship, which he used for his second voyage around the world. You know, he did some major exploring around the Canadian areas, and this was after Christopher Columbus and Spain started colonizing. So England wanted to try to get in there. You know, you have famous privateers, John Hawkins, Francis Drake. You had the Anglo-Spanish Wars, which Queen Elizabeth kind of ruled, and you had Richard Hawklett and John D. They began having rivalries and trading with rivalries with France, trading with China. But we're a big starting point of British imperialism. They actually tried it out with Ireland, the plantations in Ireland. It trailed behind, actually, behind most European powers, but by the 16th century, the settlements in Ireland, with Protestants from England and Scotland drawing precedents, meaning they had been doing this since the 1100s, the Norman invasion of Ireland in 1169. Several people helped establish these plantations in Ireland, and they were known as the West Countrymen, and then they went over to the Americas and kind of did what they did there. There were some terrible things that happened with the Irish. Cromwell during the English Civil War, I guess afterwards, or yeah, during the English Civil War. And here you see some maps. Here's Ireland in 1450 right here on the left, and then here's in the 17th century. And then you just have a timeline over here, so you can see how things changed. And, you know, if you think about it, it affects modern politics today. There's a lot of politics from Ireland, like the Sinn Féin party and things of that nature, that affect modern politics today. So I think it's incredibly interesting and incredibly important. Um, Continuing on, so they had this plan and they kind of used it. So we talked about the first British Empire. This is just a picture of the East India Trading Company. I could just as well put pictures of the 13 colonies. You know, in the 1570s, Elizabeth was giving patents to explore the new for overseas explorations. They start off with the West Indies. They went to Newfoundland. They founded the colony of Roanoke, which was lost, and that's a mystery. You could do a whole presentation on that. 1603, James VI of the Scots ascended to the English throne and negotiated the Treaty of London, which ended hostilities with Spain. The British Empire began to take shape in the early 17th century with English settlement of North America and small islands of the Caribbean, and the establishment of private companies, most notably this one right here, the flag of the East India Company. You might have heard, of course, Captain Jack Sparrow had some run-ins with from Pirates of the Caribbean. English and East India Trading Company, this was the flag of there. And they administered overseas trades, and of course you had the 13 colonies until they lost them with the American War of Independence in the 18th century, which was the end of the first British Empire. So here you have we need to discuss the 13 colonies. I mean, here you have a picture of African slaves in the 17th century, I guess 1670, but we don't know who the artist is. And they were working at the plantations here, and it was a big economy, and they were making a lot of money off the plantation system. You know, there's the whole triangle. They brought slaves from Africa. They worked on the plantations in the Americas, and then they brought supplies back to Europe. So the Caribbean was initially, which was south of Florida, right there. You can see in the map. The province provided England with the most important and lucrative colonies, but not before several attempts at colonization failed. And a colony, even they attempted one in Guiana in 1604. It only lasted 2 years. They tried all these colonies. I mean, of course, they got Jamaica and the Bahamas finally, but the most successful one was British colonies that later became the Americas. Starting off with the colony of Virginia, which was backed by African slaves, creating the economy necessary. And of course, they were working on the Dominion in Canada, combating with the French. So this is just a picture of what was going on at this point. So then they had a rivalry with the Netherlands. People don't talk about this often. Here's a picture of Fort St. George. It was founded in